In their promised land, we will build a new Mako-powered metropolis.
Mr. President!
Even with some fans who shy away from it, part of Final Fantasy VII's legacy was its controversial politics. You play the game as members of what is to some an eco-terrorist organization and to others a resistance group, and the opening sequence of the game involves the bombing of a power plant that, although it literally sucks the life out of the planet, also results in civilian casualties in the city where the plant is located and the explosion happened. But it was always interesting to me as an observer in the Final Fantasy VII fanbase that if the politics of the game were discussed, the discussion would be relegated only to certain topics. Environmentalism is most commonly discussed, both due to its relevance to that opening mission, and because it's something I believe most people agree on. Sometimes you'll get people talking about the anti-capitalist themes in the game, with the literal vertical stratification of the rich and the poor in Midgar, Junon, and the Gold Saucer Corel prison area, which Rebirth will be expanding upon with the Dust Bowl. When it reaches that point, you usually have some opposition from people that try to discount those themes, saying they take a back seat after the game switches focus to the search for Sephiroth. It's interesting because, well, other than it being wrong in my opinion to say that those themes take a back seat, because they continue to be explored with each new location you visit in the game, I almost never hear people discuss what I actually think is an even more prevalent political theme in the story of Final Fantasy VII: colonization. Even more so than the environmentalist narrative and the critiques of capitalism, the negative depictions of colonization juxtaposed with the positive depictions of indigeneity are central to Final Fantasy VII's story, and we see this theme manifested in a number of ways. We have Shinra's imperialist war on Wutai to force them to give up their land to build a Mako reactor, which the Wutaians outright opposed. In the original game, Wutai is turned into a resort town frequented by Shinra officials. In the remake, other than Godo, the leader of Wutai, being imprisoned and a resistance group called the New Wutai Government forming, we don't know the full scope of Shinra's impact on that land yet, and likely won't until the third game in the trilogy. We also have Shinra's attacks on Fort Condor after the indigenous-inspired people of Fort Condor reclaimed their sacred mountain from the reactor that Shinra had built on their land at some point in the past. Although not colonized, you have another example of indigenous people with Red 13 and his tribe in Cosmo Canyon, a place that counters Shinra's ideology of consumption with no regard to the planet, and a location that is important to the anti-Shinra resistance group I mentioned previously, Avalanche. The building of the reactors and respectively a military base and a theme park in the lands of Junon and Corel are also manifestations of colonization, especially after the recent book by Nojima, Traces of Two Pasts, teaches us that these areas used to be called the Republic of Junon before Shinra arrived. The desire and actual act of building theme parks on top of the ruins of a community is an especially bizarre modern-day form of colonization that I love FF7 for capturing in this way. Most recently, via Ever Crisis, the world has been expanded to include Rador, and the story of the first soldier so far has covered Shinra's at least attempted colonization of that land as well. You see, it would be incomplete to separately talk about the game's environmentalist and anti-capitalist themes without talking about colonization, because just like in the real world, all three of these political realities intersect. If nothing else, that should be the main takeaway of this chapter. It's actually truly remarkable that a fantasy game that came out on PlayStation in 1997 captured such an astute reflection of the reality of the world that people to this day still fail to realize. But before I talk about how these political themes intersect, let's keep looking at how colonization manifests in FF7's story. Okay, so I mentioned Wutai, Fort Condor, Cosmo Canyon, Junon, Corel, and Rador. And to be fair, those locations and the stories that take place in them are secondary to the main plot. So how is colonization central to FF7's story? Well, what is Shinra's goal in FF7?
In the distant past, our planet was home to a people we call the Ancients. Their scripture, too, has endured. We who are born of the planet, with her we speak, her flesh we shape. Unto her promised land shall we one day return. By her loving grace and providence, may we take our place in paradise. A green and verdant land where boundless Mako energy will provide for our every need. Shinra is working for you to fulfill the hope of the ancients and lead us to that promised land. We shall not rest until our dream is realized.
It's to find the Promised Land, a fabled fertile land rich in Mako energy ready to be drained from the planet, and a location of Shinra's dream of building Neo Midgar. In other words, more colonization. Barrett even identifies it as such in Chapter 17 of Remake.
Shinra thinks it's true. They've been searching for the Promised Land for a long time.
And they must think you can lead them to it. Can you?
Nope. Someday, maybe, I'll find it in me. But now, not even if I wanted to.
Even if you could, that land belongs to the... to you and your people. Shinra's after it because they believe it's rich in Mako. Mako they've got no right to claim. But they'll try to take it anyway, won't they? Greedy bastards will never stop.
And not only that, but Shinra's goal, to find and exploit the Promised Land, is imparted on the main villain of the story, Sephiroth. It was the whole reason for its creation by Shinra. Although his relationship to that land, and how he wants to exploit it, are different because it wasn't merely Shinra that imparted this goal onto him. But more on that in the next chapter. For those of you watching who have never played FF7, it must be striking you as odd how casually I'm referring to a place called the Promised Land, because you know the Promised Land in a different, real-world context. It is very common for fantasy and science fiction stories to take inspiration from history, mythology, religion, and even contemporary world events. The term Promised Land on its own has significance to the Abrahamic religions, but in a story that centers colonization so prominently, both in the main plot and the various side plots, could there be more to this illusion? Could the game be seen as an allegory for the colonization of Palestine? Okay, so this isn't your average Final Fantasy VII video. Final Fantasy VII has been lauded, and rightfully so, as a pioneer in RPG storytelling. The theme of the game, as stated many times by the game's developers in multiple interviews, is simply life, and I think it's this theme that has allowed the game to be analyzed with many different perspectives and adored by its fans. For me, as a fan of the game since I was 5 years old, and as a Palestinian living in the diaspora, I couldn't wait anymore to discuss my perspective on my favorite game of all time, and one that I don't think many of you have heard before. My life, whether I like it or not, is inherently political. And life, the theme of the game, whether we all like it or not, is also political. And listen, trust me when I say I love this game for all the typical reasons fans of the game talk about it. The plot twists, the cool characters, the relationships, the magic, the sci-fi elements, the goofiness, all of it. And I know the heart of FF7 is a story of a broken man who realized his true power only after accepting the trauma and failures of his past, removing his false ideas about heroism, and joining his friends to fight for a better future. But as I got older, I developed an added layer of love for this game's story as I realized how deep its themes really went, and how relevant they were to my own life. In a sense, this video has been over a decade in the making. While you may see this game's story through the lens of the hero's journey, or through the lens of the relationships that tie the characters together, for the duration of this video series, I am asking you to put on a political lens. So to be completely clear, I know Square did not make a game that is secretly about Palestine. This isn't some conspiracy video series, it is merely my perspective as a Palestinian playing the game. Because I'm expecting some people to watch this video who are unfamiliar with FF7, let me say that this game is the baby of Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshinori Kitase, Kazushige Nojima, Tetsuya Nomura, and Motomo Toriyama, and I can't say for a fact what their intent was while world building and choosing words like the Promised Land, the Calamity, the Chosen One, and Birthright, terms that can trigger any Palestinian for reasons I will be discussing in future videos. My goal for this video though is for you to see that colonization is embedded into the very heart of this story, and I hope you will feel more free to talk about it. While in the next chapters I will be drawing parallels and discussing the allegories of Genova, Sephiroth, the planet, and Aerith as they relate to Palestine, you can draw these parallels with many other cases of colonization or settler colonialism, historical and contemporary, and I encourage you to do so. And I know this is an uncomfortable topic. If you live on colonized land, there is some cognitive dissonance that rears its ugly head whenever this topic comes up. I urge you though to at least start by recognizing, even if you're a recent immigrant, the land that you're living on, the cruel way it was taken from our fellow humans not too long ago, and the continued struggles faced by the survivors of those peoples. The other problem is you've probably been raised to think a certain way about colonization or settler colonialism, whether you're conscious of it or not. Some of you probably don't even recognize the gravity of its impact, the violence inherent to it, the dehumanization of the indigenous that comes with it, and, in a way that is very relevant to the other core themes of Final Fantasy VII, the destruction of life and land, integral to maintaining it. Earlier I mentioned that the political themes in FF7 intersect in the game as they do in the real world, but let's look a little more into that while also looking at how that happens in the case of Palestine. The initial factors leading to colonization aren't always straightforward. There are material reasons that support and sustain the colonization of a land, and there are also ideological reasons. I will be talking more about the ideological reasons in chapters 2 and 3, but for the rest of this chapter, I'll be focusing on Shinra and how Shinra's system of control in the world of FF7 parallels the system of control in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Let's go over some basic material reasons for colonization. Companies desire resources which are found in a certain region. In order to obtain those resources at minimal cost, ownership is secured even if violent means are necessary. Even if not an initial motivating factor, after the land has been taken, companies will sustain the colonization of it by exploiting the land and its resources at the cost to the native population, while bolstering the colonizer. When the native population inevitably tries to resist, military force is used and infrastructure becomes necessary to be built in order to control them. Trade deals and foreign aid to the colonizer from other nations will then complicate the matter, as the colonizer receives money to spend on weapons and other technology from the companies based in those other nations. This incentivizes continued war and further building of a militarized state that establishes further domination of the natives, and the cycle continues. This is called the military-industrial complex. New weapons to be used by the colonizer or sold to the third parties are also often tested on the native population. Now in Palestine's case, there are a number of companies that profit off of and sustain its colonization by supporting Israel's system of control. But first, to those who are unfamiliar, what does the infrastructure of control look like in Palestine? One of the staples of the Israeli occupation is the limitations on Palestinians to freely move throughout the West Bank or in and out of Gaza, let alone the rest of historic Palestine, and the separation of Palestinian communities from each other. The West Bank is divided into 3 sections, areas A, B, and C, along with East Jerusalem. Area C, which makes up about 60% of the West Bank, is administered by Israel and contains the vast majority of Israeli settlements, deemed illegal under international law. Area A, which is the smallest and most densely populated area, is administered by the Palestinian Authority. However, Israel is allowed to enter at any time under the pretext of security concerns. Control of Area B is shared between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The occupation forces, again, in control of the security. Now, these are not contiguous areas like you might think, as areas A and B consist of hundreds of segments separated from each other, often referred to as Bantustans by pro-Palestinian activists due to their similarity to former apartheid South Africa. Freedom of movement between these areas is limited for Palestinians using ID cards that restrict them to certain areas during certain times of day. However, even with the approved travel permits, they will arbitrarily be stopped from traveling based on the whims of the occupation soldier on duty. License plates on vehicles in the West Bank are also color-coded. Israeli vehicles have yellow plates, while Palestinian vehicles have white or green plates. Palestinians are not allowed to travel on certain roads, and the Israeli-only roads connect the Israeli-only settlements in the West Bank to the rest of historic Palestine. Freedom of movement is further limited by checkpoints, which turn what would normally be a quick commute to a full day's excursion. There are documented 565 movement obstacles in the West Bank, including 49 fixed checkpoints and 139 floating checkpoints. These restrictions, the checkpoints, and the ID cards are made possible by companies like Hewlett-Packard, or HP, which provides the data centers used to operate Israel's VII system used by their Population and Immigration Authority. HP also provides Israel with the VII system, an automated hand and facial recognition system that controls Palestinian movement throughout the checkpoints where it's installed. The West Bank also contains what Palestinians call the Apartheid Wall. The wall cuts through Palestinian villages, such as the ancient village of Bethlehem, further dividing Palestinians from each other. The Palestinian town of Qalqilia is almost completely surrounded by the wall. Elbit Systems, a weapons manufacturer, provides the surveillance technology used on the Apartheid Wall. While much less severe in implementation, a system of ID cards and checkpoints that control your freedom of movement should be familiar to fans of FF7. The city of Midgar, with the exception of the destroyed Sector 6 plate and later the entirety of Sector 7, is divided in two sections, the upper plate and the lower slums, with each section divided into 8 sectors. In order to be able to live in or travel from one section of the city to the other, citizens need an appropriate ID card. For example, in Traces of Two Pasts, the ID card Tifa receives from Rakesh only allows her to reside in Sector 8 and doesn't allow her access to the upper plate. And during the Sector 1 and 5 bombing missions, the party uses fake ID cards in an effort to bypass the security system and access the upper plate. The train system that connects the sectors and the slums with the upper plate also contains an imaging system to validate the identity of the riders by cross-referencing their IDs with their central database, similar to the VII and VII systems I talked about earlier. We don't know too much about the building of Midgar and how the region looked like before Shinra, but in the original FF7, Jesse tells us how the neighborhoods of Midgar used to have their own names before Shinra ruled the city. Now it stands to reason that cutting up a bunch of neighborhoods into 8 equal sectors like a pizza with controlled movement in between would likely have resulted in the pre-existing communities being divided. Shinra's building of a plate on top for the rich and affluent is also akin to a settlement being built on top of these pre-existing neighborhoods. When you add to it the patrolling of the slums by the Shinra MPs, the parallel to a military occupation becomes apparent. We see a similar military presence and control in the fishing village of Junon later in the game, their waters being polluted by the plate city above and the underwater reactor built below. Now, of course, the difference is that in FF7, this system of control is based on class, while for the Israeli occupation, this system of control is based on religious, ethnic, and national identity. It is because of that basis for their system of control that many activists, human rights organizations, academics, and international bodies have called out Israel as an apartheid state. In addition to those limitations on the freedom of movement, this designation is due to many other systemic realities meant to cleanse Palestinians from the land and control the remaining population. And with each systemic injustice, there's a company involved in its maintenance. Assuming you've been paying attention to the terrible current events that largely inspired this entire video series, you're aware of the siege of Gaza. In addition to the limitations on imports and exports to, in the words of Israeli officials, put them on a diet, the restrictions on travel in and out, the limitations on fishing too far from the coast, and the shooting of Palestinians who get too close to the border fence, Gaza faces periodic aerial bombardment by the Israeli military. Pretty much every weapons manufacturer you can think of profits off of these continued escalations, including the previously mentioned Elbit Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Harris Corporation. Back in the West Bank, Palestinian homes are demolished to make room for the illegal Israeli settlements, and settlers simply taking a Palestinian home while being protected by the occupation soldiers is an often occurrence. Caterpillar is a company that is targeted by activists due to them providing militarized bulldozers, supporting Israel's policy of home demolitions. Palestinians are also routinely arrested by occupation soldiers, held in military prisons, and tried in military courts, while Israeli settlers on their land are tried in civil courts. Over half of the male population of Palestine has been through the military prison system. Palestinians are also arrested and detained indefinitely without charge or trial in a policy called administrative detention. The military prison system does not spare any Palestinian, including children who have in some cases grown into adulthood in prison after being pressured to confess to a crime. The company that administers many of Israel's prisons is called G4S, and they also operate in American prisons, which have their own accusations of human rights violations. Okay, so you might be asking now, how do these other examples relate to FF7 and Shinra? Well, to be honest, I'm mostly just trying to teach you other facts about Palestine since I got your attention. However, it is worth noting that the world of FF7 presents a highly militarized society governed by a company. You find Shinra's military police maintaining order in the slums and in almost every town outside of Midgar. While we might not see every level of society in the world of FF7, both because it's a game with obvious limitations and because, well, you play the game as wanted terrorists, it would not be hard to imagine how the militarized society functions behind the scenes. For example, I can imagine that the court and prison system in Midgar, Junon, and Corel favors those who live on the plate over those who live in the slums, or that homes are demolished in the areas Shinra conquers to make way for whatever it is they want to build on that land. The idea of resisting oppression and a militarized and industrial society's response to that resistance is a topic that is heavily explored in FF7 though, which I will be addressing in Chapter 6. It should also not be lost on you that Shinra, although a power company, was originally a weapons manufacturer, and still largely is one considering the weapons manufacturing department under the trigger-happy Scarlet receives the most money from their budget. Scarlet is somewhat a personification of a weapons manufacturer, as throughout the game she is eager to test her prototypes on those who fight against Shinra or innocents caught in the crossfire, such as in the case with Sonon's sister Melfi. To her, innovation is more important than human lives. I also think that while the previous Final Fantasies presented a more traditional empire, the presentation of the empire in FF7 as a corporate weapons manufacturer was quite a brilliant choice by the developers. And the brilliancy of that choice does not end there, as the connection of capitalism and colonization to the destruction of the environment is as apparent in FF7 as it is in the real world. In FF7, Shinra is slowly destroying the planet by siphoning its life stream, a mystical but natural substance which Shinra can convert into the Mako energy that provides the power to the cities of the world as well as their modern technology. Barrett summarizes this for us in Chapter 2 of Remake.
Take a good look. It's because of that great big pizza in the sky that people down there gotta struggle to survive. Shinra sucks up Mako while the soil turns to dust, the air fills with smog, and the flowers die.
Then leave and don't look back. That's what's always worked for me.
Well, that's all well and good, if you're only out for yourself. But the folks down there don't have the luxury of choice, you know.
In the real world, the continued wars necessary to maintain the colonization of a land contaminate the earth and pollute the atmosphere. Colonization also destroys the land by taking its resources at an unsustainable rate, and destruction of the land by the colonizer is used as a tactic to displace natives or crush their resistance. For example, in the US, it was a policy to kill the buffalo because it was one of the main food sources of the Native American tribes. In Palestine, colonists burned down century-old olive trees because of their importance to the Palestinian economy and culture. They also plant non-indigenous European pine trees in an effort to cover up the ruins of Palestinian villages, which activists have pointed to as contributing to Israel's problem with wildfires. In Palestine, environmental destruction is part of Israel's system of control. Israel dumps the sewage and trash produced by the illegal settlements into Palestinian towns and villages. They also fill wells used as water sources by Palestinians with cement, as access to the aquifers under the West Bank and Gaza are controlled by Israel, with the water being diverted to the illegal settlements and only a portion provided to the Palestinians. Palestinians are also not allowed access to the Dead Sea or to the use of its natural minerals despite it being on their land. Beauty products from companies like Ahava and L'Oreal contain minerals from the Dead Sea, benefiting the Israeli economy while stealing from Palestinians. Finally, the biggest defenders of the environment in the real world are indigenous peoples. In the US, for example, the Sioux tribe mobilized thousands of people to protest the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which would have crossed through the Missouri River and likely resulted in contamination due to oil leaks. In Palestine, grassroots organizations like Pentagon fight to put an end to the occupation, focusing on the environmental destruction caused by ceaseless colonialism. This idea is reflected in FF7's story too. Red 13's tribe in Cosmo Canyon, which is clearly inspired by Native Americans, teaches people about the planet and advocates against Shinra's siphoning of the life stream from the planet to be sold as a commodity. The tribe in Fort Condor, which also seems inspired by Native Americans, protects a mountain that is a home and a nest of an endangered condor from Shinra's military. I'll be talking more about them in the coming chapter, but in the lore of FF7, the Cetra are the indigenous people of the planet, and are referred to in the game as its stewards or guardians, protecting the planet from destruction. Capitalism, the environment, and colonization are all linked, and in FF7, Shinra is a hyperbole representing this relationship. It's a company that violently rules almost the entirety of the planet and builds, often by force, infrastructure on other people's land in order to drain the land of its resources, destroying the planet for a profit. Shinra's exploitation of the entire planet does not end, as their greed extends to the idea of the Promised Land, thus setting up one of the elements that drives the main plot of the story. As we're told in the propaganda exhibit in the Shinra headquarters in Chapter 16 of Remake, and later by President Shinra himself, Shinra Incorporated believes it's their destiny to find the Promised Land, where they will build their futuristic settlement of Neo Midgar. The pursuit of the Promised Land itself, the idea that it is some group's destiny to secure a territory and take its resources, or to claim ownership of the land by divine right and genetics, should already be making you think of certain ideologies present in the real world. Ideologies like Manifest Destiny and Zionism. FF7 represents these colonialist ideologies using the main villains. As I discussed in this chapter, one is the dystopian, world-dominating weapons manufacturer and power company that we call Shinra, as I will be discussing more in Chapter 3. The other is a hyperbolic personification of supremacism, who we call Sephiroth. That's it for this chapter, but I would like to revisit a question I posed earlier. Could the story of Final Fantasy VII be seen as an allegory for the colonization of Palestine? I think the answer is yes, and I hope you stick with me in future chapters to learn exactly why, because in this chapter, we really only scratched the surface. So one of the main goals of this video series is to use the storytelling of Final Fantasy VII as a tool to educate people both in the FF fanbase and beyond about Palestine. But while that is at the heart of this video series, education alone isn't enough. So at the end of each chapter, I'll be giving an action item that relates to what I talked about during that video that you can do to help support the struggle for a free Palestine. And for this video, there are two. The first is BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. BDS is an organized movement started by Palestinian civil organizations to put pressure on Israel to comply with international law by targeting the Israeli economy and companies complicit in the occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. The companies I mentioned throughout this chapter are all targeted by the BDS movement. I will include a link to the information about the movement in the description. As a consumer, you can support the movement by buying alternatives to the products being targeted and spreading knowledge about the campaign throughout your networks. If you're a student or a member of any other institution that invests in companies complicit in the occupation, support the calls at your institution to divest from said companies. We're a long way from seeing significant sanctions against Israel, but as a voter and a taxpayer, you can also put pressure on your representatives by calling them and asking them to end all foreign aid to Israel, especially after the inhumane use of that aid in recent months. The second action item you can support is the Stop Politicians Profiting from War Act, very recently introduced by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. The bill aims to prohibit members of Congress, their spouses, and children from having any financial interest in any company that does business with the Department of Defense and banning them from trading defense stocks. You can help by calling and emailing your local representatives and members of Congress to support the passing of the bill. Now before I go, I just wanted to address some housekeeping items, especially because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will be coming out soon. I will not be using any scenes or story additions from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in this video series. This is for two reasons. One is obviously to avoid spoiling it for others, especially for those who still don't have a PS5 and won't be playing Rebirth until much later. The other is because this video essay series is mostly written already. It just takes me a lot of time to edit these videos. So it's been written mostly with just the original game and remake in mind. Just like with how Remake took a different approach to the final scene of the opening bombing mission, Rebirth may go in some different directions as well. So to avoid having to go on too many tangents, the 7 chapters of this series use the text of the original game as the basis for the analysis, and bring in scenes from Remake and the compilation if I find that they enhance the analysis. I will likely do an addendum video long after Rebirth's release, where I focus on any scenes or dialogue from Rebirth that I find relevant, and will likely do the same with the third part of the trilogy. Thanks for watching. In addition to analyzing FF7's story and teaching people about Palestine in a creative way, I hope this video series fosters some discussion in the FF fanbase about the heavier topics explored in the game, so please, leave a comment and let me know what you think about Shinra and their role in FF7's story. And if you'd like to stay updated for the next chapter, feel free to like and subscribe.
If that's what you want. Thank you.